Welcome everyone to this new module that's primarily directed at new hires for their preparation, and they're going through new hire training, but this certainly will have a lot of value for a lot of people who've already been through training. And I'm going to get into a number of different things that are pretty important for a line operation. So hopefully there may be something here that you will find important. This particular module is going to be associated with low visibility and identification of approach lights, runway, transitions from instrument into visual conditions to land. Now, there's a lot of different nuances, a lot of different types of low visibility approaches, and we're going to cover them all. But in this particular case, it is something that is going to be, in general, that has to do with situational awareness and flying skills. So the one thing that I really want to emphasize with everything that I'm going to be presenting in these modules that have associated with new hire training, no procedure or no airline protocols are intended to be represented in any of these videos. The information is information about situational awareness, techniques, flying skills, and you can incorporate your own airline procedures among the information that is shared here. But I just want to make sure that you understand that whether unintentionally or intentionally, it is not my intent to conflict with what would be an individual airline's procedures or protocol. So let's start with some low visibility approach situational awareness. Now, number one, most pilots don't realize on the Boeing 737, Boeing sets up an ideal seat for flying, let alone it being important for instrument approaches, and we're going to go over that information. So with this, when we talk about situational awareness and you're in the situation of making a low visibility approach, I want you to make sure that you get in the habit of double checking the cockpit setup for the specific type of approach. There's a lot of different low visibility approaches, but double check both sides of the cockpit are set up properly for the respective approach. Review in your own mind what your responsibilities are, what your procedures are as the pilot flying, if you are going to be the pilot flying the approach, or the pilot monitoring for that particular approach. There's different responsibilities by many procedures with airlines, but what's more important is some of the things we'll talk about here, some of the distinctions between pilot flying and pilot monitoring. If there's any questions about anything, discuss that among the two of you. Personally, I think whenever you're making a low visibility approach, it's a good idea as part of a briefing, whether it's required or not, is both of you talk over some of the things that you're going to be involved in doing during that respective approach between the two of you. Brief it on the arrival or prior to the arrival, but specifically for the approach. You don't do these approaches that often. And, there's a lot of errors that are made in terms of call-outs, in terms of understanding. And so it's a good idea to always review everything between the two of you as you discuss the approach. If you're the pilot monitoring or the pilot not flying, have a good, clear voice and enunciate things with a volume that the pilot flying, who's maybe really concentrating, can really hear. Don't be talking in a normal voice, kind of up the level of your voice octave for the call-outs that you have on an approach. When you are cross-checking, make sure you check both sides of the cockpit, not just your side. Make sure that you have total personal situational awareness for the entire cockpit, not just your side. If the autopilot's on, that allows the best total situational awareness. You don't get a fixation on things And when you're concentrating on flying very often, that means that what you're doing is concentrating a lot more on the PFD. Now, I want to make a point here to use the autopilot. The autopilot does a great job. It frees you up for better total flying and situational awareness. I'll discuss the distinction between the two. But what it really means is I don't fixate on the PFD. I've got a lot of other things that I should be scanning during the reason I want to really emphasize and encourage the autopilot use, it allows you to have a total situational awareness and flying situational awareness. Very often when we're flying, we have a greater fixation on the PFD and don't use some of the other important instrumentation and area information that's available to you. So I want to encourage scan, 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 and we'll cover those appropriate instruments along the way. Here is a very important point that I want to emphasize for the pilot monitoring. Regardless of the visibility and your expectations of where you're going to start to see some approach lights, if you're the pilot monitoring, start to scan outside and inside below 1,000 feet. The big thing is starting to go outside. Don't have a fixation on the instruments. You're not the one that's flying. You should be the one to scan. And the earlier you can pick up and notice approach lights, the better off it is. Remember, all visibilities, low visibilities, there's a distinction between what they give you as the prevailing visibility, and on the particular approach you may have better visibility, you may have worse visibility. So just be prepared for wanting some better visibility and start to scan at 1,000 feet, out and in, out and in, out and in. Now here's another important point, and we'll discuss this in some greater detail later. Be aware of what the crosswind is, because the approach light position is going to be different relative to the aircraft center line based on a crosswind. So we'll talk a little bit about that too, but that's a very important point. Now here's one of the techniques that I would throw out for you to really use. It's very important in my mind. I've seen myself and a lot of others during my course of flying and being an instructor and a check airman. Don't transition to visual when you have approach lights only visible, especially when they first start to come into view. And later on I'm going to explain a technique that gives you a good transition during that time, where I call it a rule of thumb, where you're going to transition from a 75% instrument to 25% visual when you first pick things up. As you get lower and you get better visual acuity, make it 50-50 instrument to visual. And when you get good resolution on a runway and a touchdown zone and approach lights, then you can go to 25 instruments, 75% visual. Now that's just a rule of thumb, and I'll tell you what, I'd never give up any instrument cross-check until I touch down, until just prior to touchdown. Don't give up the instrument cues that you have available to you during a low visibility approach. Now here's what I want to talk about, what is the optimum seat position that has, and it's interesting to notice the simulation program that I have has the ideal seat position reflected here. Most pilots do not know that there's even such a thing as an ideal seat position that Boeing recommends. But here's where the ideal seat position is associated with. It's the top of the yoke, this point on the top of the yoke, and this little indice that is right here, just above the pipper here on the compass rose. Now, I want you to think about this. The reason a lot of pilots, especially those that are monitoring and even those that are flying, don't pick up approach lights is because, number one, they're in a different position than you normally look at out the windshield of the airplane. Secondly, you probably fly in a position where maybe you're too far back that means that I'm not going to have the best and optimum position to see the approach lights. Or I sit lower than setting up this particular situation. So here's what I want you to notice. It's in this area here, considering the top of the yoke in this instrument area right here, that you want to line up the top point of the yoke here with this indice that's right here. So you can see this, the cockpit presentation is a little bit slanted here. But if I took this top of this yoke and rested it right underneath here, that's an ideal position. That's what Boeing recommends as an ideal seat position for flying this aircraft. But it's most important when you're making low visibility approaches. Here's what I want to point out is that here we're on an approach and we're close to the ground. But here's a runway on a good day. So we don't have any approach lights here, but here's where we're normally going to be looking for the runway. We've got a descent rate of about 700 feet per minute, and that's normal for an approach. But the runway is up here in the windscreen. Well, if you take these approach lights and you extend them out here, look at how much lower they are than where we normally look out here. Now that maybe doesn't seem like that makes a difference, but I guarantee you it does, because if you're not in the ideal seat position and you're not looking just over the glare shield down in this area here and you're looking up here, you're not going to pick up the approach lights. Here's where they are on a low visibility approach. That's what you're going to pick up first, certainly not the runway. So be keenly aware of that. Now, a couple of other things that I'm going to point out. Here's a no-wind situation. Right here, it's less than 5 knots, okay? But when you're in a crosswind situation, if we had a left crosswind, then the nose of the aircraft is going to be pointing into the wind over here, and relative to the windscreen here, the runway is going to be off to the right. Now, please notice this too. You know, maybe that seems like it'll be easy to fall within the view of this low visibility here, but I can promise you that when you first start to pick up approach lights, you'll be looking in this area here, not recognizing situational awareness that I've got a crosswind and I should be looking slightly to the right of center. And of course, if you have a right crosswind, it'd be the other way, where the runway is going to be displaced over to the left. Now, here's a couple things I want to cover as you're on the approach. Number one, when you're making the approach, you want to obviously be concentrating on flying. Now, ideally, the autopilot should be on in these approaches. In training, you're going to have to do some proving that you can manually fly these, but most of the time you'll be flying with an autopilot, and that's the way to do it. So I don't have to have a total fixation on this instrument, and so those are some of the things that I'm going to try and bring out here now. But primarily, you're flying your cues, and you're looking to fly the glide slope. Now that's the flying situation. Now what I want to do is go over into situational awareness that's available to you. Cross-check this nav display for a number of things. First of all, minimize the distance that's available. To go to the 5-mile scope and get the finest presentation that you can. And I've got the runway that's depicted here. I want to, along with my FMC descent page, I want to see that I'm progressing on the glide path just like I am on the glide slope, that there's no discrepancy. This is most important. Here's where I can see the distance to the end of the runway, to the end of the runway. I'm going to come back to this. Over here, we don't have any wind, but if we have a wind, I ought to be aware of it all during the approach, checking the wind. Because if I have a crosswind situation, I want to be able to have some understanding of where I want to look, and that's important. Now, the other thing, too, that I want to point out, especially for the pilot monitoring, and you can do this even with pilot flying who can take a quick glance, if out the side you start to see some visibility but you don't see the approach lights yet, you got a good chance of catching those approach lights by the time you get to minimums. Now here's the other thing that I want you, this is, it takes a while before you kind of can calculate these things and get a good grasp on it. But I'm 1.5 miles from the end of the runway in this depiction here. Now, with the old visual rule of thumb, for every mile 300 feet at 700, 750 rate of descent. So if I'm 1.5 miles here and I'm at 600 feet, or really 500 because there's a little elevation here in Orlando, does this look like I'm going to be a little bit high when I break out? Or is it going to be pretty close to being on glide slope? Or am I going to be low? So kind of get an idea based on this. Now here we are, we're just below 600 feet, 1.5 miles. So this is maybe saying, hey, might be just a shade high, but at least you have some understanding of how that might relate to when I actually get to where I'm at where I'm starting to see the runway. Now here we are in a situation. The other thing that I want to cover is that there's a big difference between making low visibility approaches in the daytime, at nighttime, at dusk and dawn, and in various different weather situations, fog, snow. And I'll tell you, in my years of experience, I think the most difficult is snow. If you've got snow, visibility can really be distorted, and be prepared for different weather phenomena that be involved in this too. So anyway, we're at a point here right now where the pilot monitoring has started to pick up approach lights. And again, I want you to notice how close is to this bottom of the glare shield. It's not out here where we'd normally be looking. So if your seat position is too far back or too far down, here's where you're looking. You don't have a seat position that I can look down over the glare shield. That is a most important point I want to make in this presentation, gang. But here we are now at 0.8 of a mile from the end of the runway. We're at 200 feet. Now, again, what I want you to be aware of here is that am I going to be low or high on this? Okay? Still got the autopilot on, shows we're on glide slope, it shows we're good with FMC information, but this is telling me that I'm maybe going to be a little bit low, or I'm guessing that, okay? So anyway, be aware that approach light position is down here near the glare shield, not up in the normal windscreen up above. Now here we are a little bit closer. I've got a better view of the approach lights. It's still just approach lights, which, by the way, again, your airline may have some different protocols or procedures, but when we get to minimums and we have approach lights in sight, and let's say, for instance, it's 400 to 500 feet, if I have the approach lights in sight but not the runway in sight, by regulation, I can continue the approach. I must have the runway environment in sight by 100 feet. Now, I just want to briefly mention that. You go by your airline procedure because there may be some variances to that. But approach lights will allow you to continue the approach down to 100 feet, in which case I must have the runway environment to continue to land. So when you have approach lights in your mind, you better be prepared that I don't have the requirements to land, but I do have the requirements to continue the approach. Again, your respective airline may have different procedures on that, so abide by that. Anyway, here we're getting a better view of the approach lights, a more distinct view. Notice we're still on glide slopes here. And again, I want to point out how low this is on the windscreen for that seat position being important. And here's where I normally would be looking under visual conditions. And that's just a habit that we're in, and that's where I tend to look. Now, proceeding a little bit further here, now I have a bar here, and I'm starting to see the red lights here as I continue to approach, but I still don't have the runway environment. And again, notice here I'm a half mile, I'm at 50 feet. That, by the 3-to-1 rule, looks pretty good. Now this, I'm bringing in here the information for the pilot flying. If I'm the pilot flying this approach, I'd like to have the autopilot on as long as possible. That would be something you have to go by your respective airline procedure. But now when I heard pilot monitoring, or I saw the approach lights, I took a peek and I saw the approach lights, I like that. Go back into the cockpit, because here's where the rule of thumb comes in. When I, at this point, don't go visual. Stay primarily instruments. 75% instruments continue to fly instruments, and as a pilot flying, I'll have to go 25% at this point outside. Now for the pilot monitoring, that is going to be reversed. But anyway, we're talking about the pilot flying here. You start to get the approach lights, continue to fly with your instrumentation. Another reason this is important is because if I go visual at this point, gang, there's a good chance I'm going to go low on the glide slope or go high and even go back into the weather. Those are the two things that can happen when I just go visual at this point. However, another thing that's important, if I have a crosswind and I go visual here, if I've got a crosswind from the right, this is going to take me off of the runway. Fly these cues until you get down into the runway environment, that you've got excellent presentation of the runway environment. So here's a pilot monitoring. So when we get the approach lights and he announces approach lights, 25% of your attention is continuing to monitor the approach, and 75% would be out here. Now that's initially. And remember I said earlier, this is going to transition where both of you will go to 50-50 for your respective responsibilities, and then eventually to 25%, 75% visual cues for the pilot flying and 25% instrument. And then for the pilot monitoring, it's going to be a reverse of that, where we'll go from this 75% initially to 50-50 instrument and visual, and never give up monitoring the instrument approach. And you as a pilot monitoring are going to spend some time on the final part until near touchdown, where you are monitoring the instruments. And here I'm emphasizing this again. Do not go completely visual. I think I beat that horse well enough here so that you understand, okay? If I'm the pilot flying, I want to fly instruments, and these are the very important cues right here of FMC information for glide path, the electronic glide slope, flying your approach here with your cues, and that's what you want to concentrate on. And in this picture here, I'll every once in a while just take a peek and see how visual is going, but stay here for crosswind purposes and rates of descent. And of course, the other thing too, I really want you to get in a habit. I'll tell you what, gang, I've seen so many times, veteran pilots and others, once you get on an approach, this scope here is anywhere from staying at 20 miles, 40 miles. It's crazy. This is not being used. This is just as much of a cross-check as you're flying as your primary flight display. This is flying awareness. This is situational awareness, this whole instrument right here. Get in a habit of using it. It's very helpful. Now here we got the runway end. So now we've got the runway. This is technically be considered the runway in most airlines procedures and protocols. But again, I want to emphasize, know your respective airlines procedures as to what their qualifications are for continuing the approach and for continuing to landing. Okay, so here we are. We have this depiction here. Again, What's really important to understand here, now this still shows that I've got really some good glide slope, but I'm coming up on 50 feet here. Do I think I'm going to be above glide slope, on glide slope, or below glide slope? In this case, I would be guessing that, and notice that this is transitioned here. We're no longer on the autopilot. We've got glide path information rather than electronic glide slope, which is something that we probably shouldn't rely on totally here for an accurate glide path. So I'm going to guess here that we're going to be a little bit low. Now, in this case here, gang, what you really need to do is when you make any correction, when you decide you're going to make any correction on the glide path, make them very small, unless you're in a situation that requires an excessive one, okay? And in that case, you shouldn't be going around. But in any case here, where you're maybe going to make some of these slight adjustments here, make them very infinitesimal, whether it's pitch or whether it is lateral. Now here we finally got the touchdown zone area. I can see that I am really below. And here is where you're going to make an easy transition to change your rate of descent to make sure that you land in the touchdown zone. Now in this case here, you might even consider going around. These are areas here you can't treat like you're in visual conditions. Instrument conditions make it much more difficult. Be conservative for safety, okay? Anyway, gang, this is part 1, and I've got so much more that we're going to talk about low visibility approaches. We'll talk about Cat 1 approaches, Cat 2 approaches, Cat 3 approaches. We'll talk about RNAV approaches. We'll talk about non-precision approaches and autopilot single channel approaches. Some airlines maybe just have a single channel that they operate by regulation or by just software, and with dual channel. And there are really some differences between these two, especially in disconnecting an autopilot. And we're going to cover those things. So anyway, gang, that's it for this particular module. I hope this has been valuable to you. You can get some information that will be very helpful to you during training, but it will out there in the real world too. God bless everyone.